Greetings and welcome everyone to this, our second gathering of Poetry Unbound Plus. My name is Ben Cott with the On Being Project, and I'm excited to welcome you here tonight for this event that we are doing as the On Being Project in partnership with our friends at the Washington National Cathedral. Of course, I'm eager to introduce you to our host in a few minutes. That's Pádraig Ó Tuama, host of the Poetry Unbound podcast, who will then also welcome our special guest for this evening, poet David Kinloch, who's joining us from Glasgow, Scotland. Welcome to you, wherever you are joining us from. If you are looking for a nourishing and transformative conversation with a bit of fun in it, you are in the right place. So a few words of welcome. I'm here, as I said, on behalf of the On Being Project. I'm the Associate Director of Religious Life and Social Healing at On Being. And On Being is a project that is a nonprofit media and public life initiative pursuing deep thinking and moral imagination, social courage and joy to renew inner life, outer life, and life together. You can learn more about our work at onbeing.org. And I mentioned to you where David will be joining us from. I'm joining you today from Milwaukee, Wisconsin, which is the Potawatomi, Ho-Chunk, and Menominee homeland. And just want to acknowledge that plenty of us who are here are living on lands that have histories much older than most of the current occupants. And so for you, we invite you to learn more about the native land, perhaps that you're living on. And we're dropping a link in the chat where you can find out more. So as people continue to arrive, we invite you to introduce yourself in the chat with your name, perhaps where you're located, and if there's any information on what you do or any organizations that you're a part of or how you heard of this event, we welcome you to put those in the chat. My wonderful colleague Lily Benowitz is conducting our Zoom choreography and will be providing updates while the chat is open. And I'll be giving some more details about Zoom in a little bit, but if you have any questions, you can reach out to them for some help. In just a moment, Lily will be putting in the chat what we call our 6 grounding virtues here at On Being. And these are things that we try to embody in conversations. We try to embody these in our time together today, later on when we have a Q&A. So we invite you to read those. You're also welcome to use them in other gatherings and spaces that you're in. We have many partners in our social healing work who do use those 6 grounding virtues for their work. So now, I've said about enough, though you will hear a bit more from me in a second. I want to welcome our colleague, our friend, Terry Lynn from the Washington National Cathedral Center for Prayer and Pilgrimage to come on and say hi to all of us on behalf of the cathedral.
Thank you, Ben, and thank you, Lily, for unmuting me. Welcome, everyone. On behalf of Washington National Cathedral and specifically the Center for Prayer and Pilgrimage, I'm pleased to welcome you here to the second in the Poetry Unbound Plus series. Happy National Poetry Month to all of us in the United States. This is a great way to celebrate. We are very pleased to be working with the On Being Project on this. The Center for Prayer and Pilgrimage is a physical space within Washington National Cathedral, but we're also a programmatic space that really lives into our mission to be a house of prayer for all people and to gather people in safe, sacred community where we can share our stories and have our imaginations expanded. So I am looking forward to that today with the conversation between Pádraig and David. So thank you all again for being here.
Thank you, Terry. Good to have you here with us and grateful to be partnering with you on this. So as I said, before I turn things over to Pádraig, I do want to give you a few more Zoom instructions. And I realize that many of you over the course of the last year or so have probably been in Zoom spaces, but it is important to make sure that we all have the most enjoyable experience possible. So with that in mind, I want to let you know that there is a closed captioning is available, and you can use the CC button at the bottom of your Zoom window to turn this function on and off. We do invite everyone to turn on their cameras if you feel comfortable, so we can see one another and have that sort of intimate experience together. But of course, you are invited to participate however is most comfortable for you. So if that means turning off your screen, if that means stepping away from your computer and just listening, you are more than welcome to do that. So we will be spotlighting people as they speak, and there's a setting called it's called speaker view. So that's what we'll be using, but you can stay in this setting, or you're able to select gallery view in the top right hand corner of your Zoom screen if you want to see everyone in this room. Just so you know, everyone but the speakers will be muted during this event. Later in the gathering, you will have an option to ask a question of our speakers directly, and if we call on you, you will be given the option to unmute at that time. And along those same lines, we will have a Q&A later. So think of questions as you hear Pádraig and David talking, and you'll have a chance to share them later in the chat, but we will also make it possible for you to ask those questions over video. So at that point, I'll instruct you to raise your hand. And just so you know, if you do raise your hand and show up on video, this is being recorded for YouTube. So raising your hand is you're giving your permission to being recorded. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Pádraig. And first, we're going to turn off the chat, and the chat will open up later during the Q&A. But part of why we turn the chat off is so we can have a more sort of focused, quiet experience without any of the other noise that maybe comes with that for some people. So before I introduce my friend, I invite you to join me in taking a deep, grounding breath. Thank you. And now I want to introduce the host of our time together, Pádraig Ó Tuama. Pádraig is a poet and public theologian. He is the former leader of Corrymeela, Ireland's oldest peace organization. And here at the On Being Project, Pádraig is the host of Poetry Unbound and is our resident poet and theologian. Tonight, he is our host of Poetry Unbound Plus. Welcome, Pádraig.
Thank you very much, Ben, and thank you very much, everybody. It's a lovely thing to be with you all. You're all very welcome to the northwest of Ireland, and for tonight, most of the evening will be between the northwest of Ireland and Glasgow in Scotland. So you're welcome to a Celtic conversation about biblical literature and poetry and caricature and imagination. It is such a joy to have you here. Just a brief word about why we started Poetry Unbound Plus. There are so many different kinds of poetries that make use of mythologies and literatures from around the world. Regularly in poetry, you'll hear reference to Homer or to maybe some of the Irish mythologies or the Scottish mythologies. And over again in the last number of years, I've noticed more and more poets. Some of those poets are personally religious, some of them are not. But I've noticed more and more poets making use of biblical characters within the context of their work. And we were keen, in partnership with the Washington National Cathedral, to explore that, to hear a little bit about why would somebody turn to biblical characters? What's the experience? What's the richness in the archive and repertoire of these narratives? And with that, we've invited 4 people to be our guests, and we're thrilled that tonight David Kinloch in Glasgow is our guest. So I'd like to introduce you to him. He's a Scottish poet based in Glasgow, as I said, who is the author of 6 collections of poetry, the most recent of which is the one that we'll be hearing from tonight, In Search of Dustie-Fute, from Carcanet, published in 2017. I have my copy here. He's a former teacher of French at university level, and he is Emeritus Professor of Poetry at the University of Strathclyde in Glasgow. And he is the chair of the Edwin Morgan Trust, which supports poetry in Scotland. And this book that I mentioned was shortlisted for the Saltire Prize for Scottish Poetry Book of the Year. So we are thrilled. We're going to drop his website address in the chat as well later on, so that you can have the opportunity to find out where to buy some of his books. But first of all, David, I'm thrilled that you're here. Thanks so much for giving us the time late on a Sunday evening.
Hello, Pádraig. Thank you very much for that introduction. Can you hear me okay?
Yes. Perfectly. Yeah,
Good.
That's great. We'll get to hear a little bit about you, and we'll get to hear you reading from some of your work throughout this hour, David. But first of all, I suppose I'm curious, just as an opening question, when did you turn to poetry in your life? Was it an early thing or something that came later on?
Well, I come from quite a literary family. When I was about 12 or 13 years old, I discovered that my maternal grandfather was actually a Scottish poet, a poet called William Jeffrey. I never knew him. He died in 1946. But my grandmother, his wife, was still alive, and she told me all about him. And I suppose it was discovering that suddenly, gave me a little bit of an impetus to try and find out what poetry was all about. I started reading some of his poems, which I didn't understand at all at the age of 12. And I kind of, it went from there, shall we say. And I had some good teachers at school who sensitized me to poetry. So in that respect, I was kind of doubly fortunate, I suppose. I had relatives, and I also had good teachers.
And you studied French, is that right? And taught
I studied English and
time.
French at Glasgow University, and then I had to decide whether I wanted to continue with English or with French to postgraduate level. And I decided at that stage I really wanted to focus on French. It was an opportunity to escape to Paris. And of course, if you get that opportunity, you never turn it down. And so I spent a couple of years in Paris doing some research, and then came back to this country and became a university teacher. I worked all over England and Wales. Got back to Scotland in 1990, and I've been back here in Glasgow ever since. And I taught French for maybe around 15 or 16 years. And then I just decided that I wanted to focus a little bit more on poetry. I was writing quite a lot of my own poetry by that stage, and I had the opportunity to teach creative writing. So I kind of switched mid-career, as it were, and became a professor of creative writing at Strathclyde University. So all told, I suppose I've been kind of a teacher of one thing or another for the last 30 to 35 years. And I've stepped back a little bit from the active teaching now, and I'm still continuing to research, but I'm doing more writing and reading than over the last few years.
Oh, we're so glad you're with us. And tonight we're going to be particularly speaking about your most recent book. Even scanning some of the titles of your other books, though, one of them is called In My Father's House, which has echoes of words of the Gospels. And in this particular book, In Search of Dustie-Fute, there's a section called Some Women, which is an exploration of women's characters in the Bible, often women whose stories you're exploring through new lights, as well as there's a section which we'll be looking at later on, looking at the story of Saint Joseph, husband of Mary and father of Jesus. What is it, first of all, just thinking about the biblical women's stories, what was it about them that interested you in particular?
To begin with, this was actually, this project started as a commission. I was contacted by somebody who wanted to put together an anthology of, and I quote, strong women, and they were looking for a strong woman from the Bible. And so I chose, perhaps slightly perversely, Delilah, as in Samson and Delilah, and I tried to write a poem about Delilah from Delilah's perspective. Probably one of the least successful poems I think I've ever written. And in fact, it was politely declined by the editor of the anthology. So that was slightly humiliating. But the idea stuck with me, and I decided I would try and make things better by writing better poems in response to the women of the Bible. And I just gradually I became more and more interested in the topic as I went along. I wrote probably 15 to 20 more poems than actually ended up being published. So it was a project that really occupied me for 2 or 3 months, and I was writing pretty constantly, and just trying to find a voice for each of these characters. Some of them interested me more than others. Some of them I found easier to ventriloquize than others. And so, yeah, it's just a kind of project that took off eventually. It kind of gathered a momentum of its own.
Lovely. I wonder if you'd be able to start off by reading the Hebrew Women poem. Is there anything that you could orient people to? Are there any terminologies? I had wondered whether the Scottish understanding of tablet could be worthwhile explaining for people who mightn't know.
Yes, you don't have tablet in America. Surely you must have tablet in America and in Ireland. Tablet is fudge. So very sweet, sticky, a bit like toffee, but better than toffee. There's a slight crumbliness to it. It's good stuff. It's sweet stuff. So this first poem is called "First Letter of the Hebrew Women to St. Paul." As you know, St. Paul was in the habit of writing quite a lot of letters to people in the early Christian churches. It was a period when there was quite a lot of dissension. People were trying to make up rule books and decide who to follow. And I just thought it might be interesting to hear what the women would have to say in response to St. Paul. So this is really the Hebrew women talking back to St. Paul. Hebrew women, apostles of Christ Jesus to Paul, alleged saint, notorious scribbler, grace to you and peace from God our Father. Now look here. Adam could have said, no thanks, or apples disagree with me. He didn't. He had a bite as well. So he was deceived, just like Eve. We're equal and get used to it. We washed his feet, made his tea, stood under the cross. Where were you? On some road to Damascus. Useless. Chapter 2. This new covenant is all very well, but we have a soft spot for the old one. That tabernacle had our best candlesticks in it, a gold jar with jam by manna and a lot of tablet. We want it back. You promise this and you promise that. Be quiet. Let the hidden person of the heart speak out. Chapter the last. Every Tom, Dick, and Harry's given hospitality at yours in case they might be angels. Fine, but haven't you noticed the spinning saucers we've got above our heads? Faith is a stubborn doubt before what you despair of, and the conviction of things you can see with your own two eyes.
Thanks very much for that beautiful reading of the poem, David. I'm curious, when you take on a voice like this, like you called it ventriloquizing earlier on, are you ever surprised at what you hear coming out from your imagination or from your writing?
Yes, and I think that's absolutely essential. If you're not surprised by that voice, then I think it probably means the voice isn't working, because it's not your own voice, it's a stranger's voice. And I think that's in a sense, that's what you're trying to do when you write any poem. You know, you're trying to open a space in language for voices to come through. Inevitably, aspects of your own voice will be there, but if you're in a process of genuine discovery, then you'll hear the accents and the voices of other people, other entities, other creatures, other spirits. And I think it's the same with these particular poems. Yeah.
Were there any particular parts of the voices of the Hebrew women that struck you particularly surprisingly, David, in this one?
I was surprised by, I think probably I would say, well, what struck me most about the Hebrew women really is their practical side. You know, all the men in the Bible, it's all a bit Hollywood. They're either having visions or praying rather loudly. But these women, it seemed to me, were very down to earth. And I was quite struck and surprised, perhaps, by the sharpness of their voices. And I tried to get that quality across. It's a poem that uses comedy and humor, obviously, but I wouldn't necessarily describe it as a comic poem. It has a serious core to it.
Yeah, it's almost like there's a voice of protest or a corrective in it, really.
Yes.
In the midst of the humor is almost a survival tactic for people who have to put up being put in their place.
Yes, that's right. I mean, I think for me, the kind of key line really is in the third last stanza, "Let the hidden person of the heart speak out," which is, of course, a quotation from St. Paul himself, I think in his letter to Peter. That's a line that really stayed with me throughout the writing of the collection. Sometimes it's quite difficult to relate sometimes to the idea of spirit, we have this kind of idea of something that's not material, that's kind of floating around there in the ether. But I think that Paul's description of spirit as a person that was quite revelatory for me in a way, because if you think of your spirit as a person, well, then you can have an actual conversation, a dialogue with that person. And I think that helps you to enter into the spirit of, well, your own spirit and the spirit of the poem in this particular case, perhaps.
Yeah. And the protest of the poem too is so much about paying attention to material things, as you mentioned. Even the last two lines, faith is a stubborn doubt before what you despair of, and the conviction of things you can see with your own two eyes. There's an invitation in the poem to look at what's happening in front of you. And I'm wondering, was that an invitation for you too? Were you being invited to see what was in front of you while you were hearing these Hebrew women speak in this both comic as well as protesting poem?
Yes, I mean, I think it relates to what we were talking about previously. I'm trying to create recognizable human voices, and trying to meld them, trying to weave them into my own voice as well. And maybe that involves remembering things about people that I've met, and that I'd perhaps forgotten about, and enabling them to speak again, or aspects of their characters to speak again through the poem. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, it's intriguing because clearly you are having an imaginative connection with these women, but also creating a literal connection with voices of women from your own life and voices of your own life too. So there's a certain kind of gathering together of multiple voices that are all being made manifest here.
You've put it much more eloquently than I have.
I wonder if you could read Ruth as well. We're going to stay with some of these poems from women.
Sure.
The voices of women.
Okay. Ruth. Ruth stands in the field and sees it is hot and hard and dry. She feels she must not stop and say no to Naomi. No, Ruth says, and bends to gather up stray barley heads that lie like bells, notes lost as the harvest's hum is baled in neighbors' barns. She works all day, careful of all that falls away, then places her basket on the threshing floor. At first she sees a simple glean of corn, of grain, a glean of yellow thyme and wheat. But as she stares, a shoal of herring weaves the wicker, dark glass glints, brass shavings gleam. She sees in part and finds her tongue. Where you go, I will go, she says to Naomi. She turns to the owner of the field, proposes marriage, feels the kick of David jump up the weir of generations, the king who will love Jonathan, and the endless line of women who will give birth to God.
This poem is in quite a different register to the first one. You know, the first one that you read from the Hebrew women writing back to St. Paul is quite a protest poem. But this one, you really have gone in almost in a summative way to the story of Ruth and narrated something from within. You're not pushing the edges of the story the way you were with the Hebrew one. What was it in this one that made you so curious about Ruth and so curious about staying within the story as it's received from the biblical narrative?
Well, I mean, as with all of these poems, really, I'm trying to create mini dramas. And one of the things about Ruth's story is that it's quietly dramatic. And the way I tried to do that in the poem really was to conflate the two key scenes in the book. The first one is, of course, the moment where she says no to Naomi. No, I'm not going to stay here. I'm going to come back with you. I'm going to accompany you on your journey. And then the later scene when she effectively proposes marriage to Boaz. And so I tried to orchestrate the poem in such a way that it's almost as if those two moments from the same story are happening simultaneously. And I also wanted to show how Ruth is future oriented. She's pointing towards the future. She'll become a mother. One of her descendants will be Jesus. And I felt probably the best way to do that was to reach beyond the book of Ruth itself, and to take passages, other well-known passages from the Bible, and use them metaphorically. So the famous passage from 1 Corinthians, but there's also a kind of a memory there of the parable of the loaves and the fishes as well. And I think that kind of central metaphor helps to open up the story of Ruth to those other important moments that lie in the future.
Yeah, I'm always so moved by that line where it says, but as she stares, a shoal of herring weaves the wicker. Somehow the arrival of these fish, I don't know why, there's something about the image of that. I can see it, see it imaginatively. What does that shoal of herring do for you? Is that the coming of the kind of the parable or the story of the feeding of with the loaves and the fishes, or what else could be caught up in that for you?
Yes, absolutely. That's what I was thinking of. And obviously it's also the sunlight on the wheat, on the grains of wheat. So yeah, it's double in that sense.
I mean, we'll come on later on to talk about masculinities, but even in this very quick reference here, feels the kick of David, jump up the weir of generations, the king who will love Jonathan. You seem to always be interested in queering masculinities also and bringing that narrative in, especially in some of your other biblical poems. What is it about queering that is so interesting to you?
Well, I've been interested all my life in marginal voices and so-called minority voices, in people who are sometimes, very often, are not allowed to be center stage. It's always interesting to see the world from the perspective of somebody who lives their life to some extent on the margins of society. The women in the Bible, they have their own voices, but the voices are circumscribed. They're subject to patriarchy, and there are parallels there with the voices of gay people, and how they have been treated, how they have been allowed or not allowed to speak in the course of history. So I'm interested in bringing these kinds of issues into dialogue with each other, those kinds of minority voice into dialogue with each other.
Mm-hmm. I wonder, could you do that even more for us with the poem Cain's Wife?
Okay.
So this character is barely narrated really in the biblical text. I suppose she's the daughter-in-law of Eve. Is that a way to describe her?
Yes. She's also the mother of Enoch. And when Cain founded the first city, he called the city after his son. So although in this poem, Cain's wife is a kind of nomadic figure, there's also the seed of something else there, of an end to nomadic wandering, and to a more rooted existence, which was something that I was interested in just kind of suggesting, perhaps just touching on briefly. This is Cain's wife. I was a tiller, a sower, a whore, a sewer. Sorry, I'm going to start that again. I was a tiller, a sower, a whore, a sower, a siver, a scyther, a shearer, a reaper, a planter, a mower, a herder, a milker, a minder, a plower, a thresher, a gleaner, with no time for a name of my own. Then he killed Abel, and I was a drifter, a tramper, a marcher, a prowler, a runner, a walker, a hiker, a rover, a ranger, a jogger, a beggar, a hawker, with no time for a name of my own. There was desert and wold, bush and veldt, steppe and silt, mould and dust. I was gravel, I was pebble, I was flint, I was turf, and I dreamed of a space crossed by voices that raised me, by arms that held me, and hands that offered me to lips that kissed me, with no need for a name or a time.
I think this was the second poem of yours I ever read, and I was so moved by it. This voice that is saying, I am so many things. A voice of Cain's wife that isn't given a name really, and isn't given any kind of caricature. And here in 145 words, I counted them up, you give so many different aspects of the life of survival she had, as well as dreams and yearnings that she had. Why did she,
well,
it's so emotional, this poem.
Yes, one of the reasons I think is because it's inspired by a particular painting by Fernand Cormont, a 19th century artist. And the painting depicts a rather disheveled, muscular, semi-naked Cain moving through the desert, shepherding his family. There's a little tribe of children and teenagers following him through the desert. And in the middle of this scene, there is a kind of wooden raft-like structure, and Cain's wife is sitting there suckling two of her children. And that painting reminded me really of all these scenes we see in our televisions of immigrants. At the time I was writing it, I had been watching, immigrants washing up on Mediterranean islands, families who had been through just sheer hell. And there's something of that, I think, perhaps, that kind of emotion, that sense of people just being harried from pillar to post, and given no rest whatsoever. It's also a poem, I think, that it's a poem about naming. There's a sense in which she's initially she's seen simply in terms of her occupations and never for herself. She has no name. But then there comes a moment when she realizes perhaps that she doesn't need a name. In a sense, it's a poem that's against names and identity, and it's a plea more for community. And that's really what the final stanza of the poem is trying to do. The names disappear, and instead you get a series of kind of crisscrossing actions. And these are the actions of a kind of loving kindness, of people reaching out their arms to hold her up, and to give her not a name and not time, but a space. So I think there's a sense in which that poem is about space. It's about desert space initially, and then it's about a kind of spiritual space that she eventually discovers through other people.
You're so fluent when it comes to going into not just the scandal of these characters or the scandal of their being ignored in a religious text, but going really deep into the text and into the imagination about them. Did all of that interest come from a literary point of view, or have you had a religious story in your past or your present that informs all of that? I'm curious about your relationship with the biblical text.
Well, the Bible has been both a book of faith for me and also a source of inspiration, a source of literary inspiration. Currently, I would describe myself as agnostic. And I suppose you could even think of this sequence of poems as a kind of testing of my own agnosticism. So, I think if there is emotion present in these poems, it's coming out of a sense of discovery, yes, but also regret for something that I've lost, something perhaps that I might rediscover. I don't know whether I will or not. So that's why these characters are not just they're not just characters. To me, they're real people, real voices that I heard, without being completely crazy, real voices that moved me, and perhaps it's because they moved me. I've been able to kind of create the kind of poems that I've written, and I hope perhaps some of them might move other people.
Yeah, very few of these poems have anything describing something miraculous. You seem to be really interested in the nitty-gritty of the everyday, to present the biblical characters in a way where they are utterly believable in a conversation with our own lives. Is that deliberate? Do you deliberately choose moments that could be considered to be in the vernacular of human experience?
Yes. This is because it seems to me that there's such distance, distance of time, distance in terms of culture between us in the 21st century and the people of those communities. And you need to find common ground so that some kind of dialogue can open up, so that you can shrink that distance. And therefore, the emphasis in all of these poems really is on the humanity of the people. I'm not writing sermons, I'm not writing homilies, I'm writing little dramatic monologues mostly, and trying to make these people as believable, as real as possible in the present moment of reading about them. And my hope, I suppose, is that if people have enjoyed the poems, then maybe they might go back to those stories in the Bible. And it's at that point that there will be an encounter with the divine, with the extraordinary. I don't really feel that I have access to those moments of extraordinariness. All the extraordinariness is in the Bible, and I can only offer an avenue of approach to that.
And could you say a little bit more about that loss that you spoke about?
About what, sorry?
That sense of loss that you spoke about, as you said that you might be approaching these from an agnostic point of view, and that maybe an undercurrent throughout some of these poems is a certain sense of loss. Is that the loss you're talking about, the loss of a sense of faith?
Yes, I think so. I think, I'm not sure. I think probably all my poetry, is about loss in one form or another. I hope that doesn't mean that it's dreadfully boring and serious and po-faced. I try not to make it like that, and that's why so many of the poems in this little collection approach things through a vein of humor. But poetry for me is a way of trying to recapture things that I've lost, emotions, sometimes people. That was the case in when I was writing about my father in my father's house, which is really a kind of extended elegy. It's the case in relation to my first book of poems, which was an extended elegy for a friend who died of AIDS way back in the 1980s, in the late 1980s. So yes, I now that you ask me that question, I suppose it makes me realize that in a sense that's what an awful lot of my poetry is about: loss and trying to come to terms with it. And the poems are a kind of frame, like a picture frame, that you put around that moment of loss, and that helps you to cope with it a little bit better.
I've got one more poem I'd like you to read, and got a couple of questions for you about that. But just right now, we're going to open up the chat so that folks can put in a few questions to the chat, so that we can have some ready. Because after this next poem and a few questions from me, we're going to hear from folks in the audience. So I'd love it if you would read number 9 from Joseph's Dreams. It's called St. Joseph's Dream. Maybe even before you turn to that, what drew you to Joseph as a character?
Excuse me. The sequence Joseph Dreams was written after Some Women, and I would say it's a much more, despite some of the things I've been saying about the collection, it's an even more personal collection. Yeah, I'll just read the poem and then maybe say something about it after it. St. Joseph's Dream. In all the pictures, I'm sleeping, dozing on a rock, snoring by a candle. She, of course, got to shake hands with the angel. I woke with a kind of boner I haven't had in decades and expected a larger life, less falling asleep on the job. I've dreamt each big decision, the move down south to Egypt, the sideways turn to Galilee. The boy dreams too. Just to look at him, though, I can see I don't feature in his. What use are dreams, really, if you're the one asleep in them? Yeah, St. Joseph is one of those figures who, again, he's kind of on the margins, really. The eternal stepdad, somebody who's always dreaming, somebody who's perhaps, in a sense, a little disappointed, perhaps. It's difficult to imagine what his feelings must have been. He's continually forced to play second fiddle in a way. The whole sequence really is a kind of exploration of childlessness in a way, childlessness. I don't have children. That's one of the regrets of my life. And nevertheless, I've been very fortunate to be in the kind of position of a father when it comes to teaching my students. That's a tremendous privilege, to be a kind of midwife to kids who are trying to write poems for the first time. And they are very grateful to you. Students are often very, very grateful. But then it stops and they go away, they move on. And you're kind of left there. You want more of that gratitude from them. There is another kind of a sense of loss there as well. And of course, that's as it should be. That's natural, it's inevitable. So I suppose the whole sequence is a way of exploring different kinds of paternity and different kinds of paternal loss as well.
And you're doing that by stepping in sometimes fairly audacious ways to the character of Joseph. I mean, certainly the way Catholics would speak about Joseph, the description of Joseph and Mary's marriage is one that's celibate. And here, you're describing Joseph as having, the erection of a decade. And then he's also considering ambition and passivity. You're going into his character and shaking him loose from certain dogmatic or even devotional imaginations by making him much more real in some sense. Does that ever feel nerve-wracking for you to take a character that people might have a deep devotion to and to render him both believable, but also perhaps a little more shockable? Or more shocking?
No, because I think that true devotion I think it's really important to understand the humanity of these characters. And that's my job in a sense. There's a sense in which I feel I can't write about saints, really. I mean, I can only write about human beings, fallible human beings, and perhaps orient the poem in such a way that it reminds people of the other aspects of the story that are dealt with in the Bible, for example, that I can't approach directly. You know, it comes back to the whole issue of comedy and whether you can use comedy to speak about people who are objects of faith for others. And I suppose what I'd say to that is really religion is part of life, and life is a mixture of comedy and tragedy. And in a sense, you're doing religion a great disservice if you refuse the comedic approach. It's almost as if you're saying, well, religion isn't part of life. Religion is out there. It's different. And I think that I feel that's mistaken, really. I don't know if that answers your question.
Oh, I'm delighted. I'm thrilled. I love what you do. And it's one of the features that I find in so many people who are exhibiting a great biblical literacy in the poetries they're writing, but for very good and important reason. They're unencumbered by the anxiety of keeping the devout feeling safe. And not doing that just for the sake of being scandalous or being shocking, but doing it for the sake of taking these characters in the literatures of religion very seriously, and in a certain sense, by rendering them sometimes shocking in their humanity, that's taking them far more seriously sometimes than perhaps devotion does.
I think there's a line that you can cross when it comes to humor. And you know, if any of these poems give offense, then there's a sense in which they fail as poems, because you know, if you give offense, then you simply make people angry. And as you know only too well, Pádraig, from your role in mediating conflicts, when people are angry, no dialogue can happen. But when people smile, you know, when a joke is cracked, then that is when everything becomes possible again.
A friend of mine who's been a senior mediator with the United Nations has always maintained that a little bit of charm goes a very long way, even in the most serious of mediations.
Absolutely.
I'm going to hand over to Ben, who's going to curate a few questions from our gathered audience here. Over to you, Ben.
Thanks, Pádraig. I want to thank those of you who've already submitted questions. And Jay, I want to acknowledge that I see your hand, but we're gonna start somewhere else. And before I get to that question, I just want to give instructions to everyone, just to remind you how this is going to go. We're going to have time for 3 or 4 questions, and there are 2 options for how to submit your question. And thankfully, we already have people demonstrating so wonderfully how to do this. So what you can do is you could enter it right into the chat. And we will see that. You could send it to everyone. If you don't feel comfortable just sending it right to everyone, feel free to send it directly to me and I'll get your question. And the other option is to raise your hand. And there is a raise your hand function in Zoom. It's moved around a little, so it depends what version you have, but you will see it on the bar at the bottom of your Zoom panel. And it's either going to be on the bottom left side, or you'll see a reactions button. It's like a smiley face with a plus. If you click on that, then you're able to raise your hand. And as a reminder, by raising your hand, you're consenting to be on the screen live and in our YouTube recording. So let's dive into the first question. We have a question from Tomas. I hope I'm saying that correctly. I know you were with us last time, so welcome back. And I'll just read this, David. So it says, firstly, David's reflection on his own poetry in contrast to the extraordinariness of the Bible reminds me of the line from John O'Donohue, "May your prayer of listening deepen enough to hear in the depths of the laughter of God." And he says, I love the almost wicked sense of humor in his poems. Given how David is trying to lead us back to the stories of the Bible and also connect them to the modern day, What have the poems taught him about us? And he adds brilliant session in every sense of that word. And so I think this is almost sort of building off of some of the comedy and tragedy you were just talking about. But yeah, given you're trying to lead us back to the stories of the Bible and also connect them to the modern day, what have the poems taught him about us?
Us in the sense of contemporary 21st century human beings.
Yeah,
that's how I'll interpret that. Yes, well, that maybe we ourselves are not so different from some of those people thousands of years ago. That we experience the same emotions, jealousy, hope, despair, as they did. I think it's that sense of human connection, really, that that's what moved me most in the writing of the poems, and what I hope is the gift of the poems to the readers who take the trouble to read them.
Thank you. So what we're going to do now is we're going to go to Jay. And Jay, maybe you just want to say your name and where you're joining us from. And Lily will invite you to unmute yourself.
Thank you, Jay at your Broadbar. I'm in Toronto, Ontario, Canada, North America. I'm trying to articulate this because this comes out of my own struggle with my own writing, which is, and you, Rega mentioned not creating a situation where the devout feels safe, or as you said, not giving offense. But all that assumes a certain literacy, a certain relationship to the text to begin with, which I struggle with in my own writing. So my question is, to what extent is there an assumption of some understandings of the literacy of the text, a grounding, a limit, and inform your own writing and possibly even where you publish? Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, I don't necessarily, I was about to say that I'm kind of assuming that there is some level of knowledge of the Bible there for people in order to really fully follow the poems and to get something out of the poems. But I don't think I would say that, actually. I hope that the poems are written in sufficiently interesting a way. And I don't mean that necessarily simply in terms of the subject matter, but in terms of the technique, in terms of the artistry, in terms of the skill, in terms of the acoustic dimension of the poems. I hope that there's sufficient stimulus there for people to actually want to find out more. I've always thought of poetry as a process of research, of discovery, and I hope that the poems are written sufficiently well to stimulate people to go off on their own voyage of discovery, and hopefully that will take them back into the biblical text. They are forms of rewriting, and in that sense, they participate in postmodern. They're postmodern, really, in a way, aren't they? Really, they're interested in, you know, if you're speaking back to the center, if you're interested in critiquing the traditions of the culture in which you have been brought up, then inevitably there's a process of rewriting takes place. Yeah, I'll stop there.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jay, for your question. I'm wondering if anyone else wants to raise their hand. Got a question that you're eager to ask? Pádraig, feel free to jump in.
Right. I mean, picking up on what Jay had just asked you, David, what's some of your editing process, David? Do you have a specific thing that you do with editing? Do you leave things distill for a while, or How do you go about waiting until a poem is matured enough that you think it has its own voice?
It's changed a lot over the years. Initially, I wrote everything in longhand, and it would be a process of scribbling and crossing out and shoving bits of paper in drawers and revisiting them in a fortnight's time. Now that we have these wonderful computers, Macs and stuff like that, I find that I write directly onto the screen, which has its downside as well, because it means you lose an awful lot of the first ideas that you have and then cross out. I don't try to save that material anymore. And so the poem just goes through a series of kind of on-screen drafts, and eventually I end up with a version that I'm happy with. At which point I send it to a couple of close friends who tear it to shreds, and then I start again.
Everybody needs those friends.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. Ben, I see there's more questions that come in, so back to you.
Yeah, thank you. So after this, I'll just say, everyone, if we'll have time for one more if anyone else wants to jump in, but I'm going to kind of combine a couple of these questions. Suzanne asks, who fascinates you most from the Bible and why? And then Anne is wondering if she said she'd love to hear Mary Magdalene's voice via your listening heart and brilliant craft, and wondering if you have a poem that features her. So I'll put that in there, and then I'll add myself. Is there a character from the Bible that you're sort of you've been wanting to write about, but maybe you just haven't been able to figure out how to do that yet? So any of those questions about characters in the Bible and your desire to bring them to life through poetry.
Well, yes, I do have a poem about Mary Magdalene, which is actually in that sequence. I could read it if you wish. I don't know whether there's time to do that. But otherwise, in terms of characters, yes. Jesus of Nazareth crops up in quite a lot of these poems, but he's a kind of bit player in them. And for pretty obvious reasons, I would like to be able to talk, to speak, to write more directly about that particular figure. I haven't as yet had the temerity to do that. Maybe I will one day, I'm not sure. I was thinking about books of the Bible, and I would say that probably, it depends what kind of mood I'm in. If I'm in a kind of Hollywood mode, then I love Genesis, just because there's so much going on there. It's pretty epic. But if I'm feeling more quiet, more reflective, then yes, the Book of Ruth is really important for me. And I love the Gospel of St. John, partly because I think you get a real sense of John's own character coming through that particular gospel. Yeah.
Thank you. And I'm sure that everyone would love to hear the Mary Magdalene poem. I will be the bad guy in saying we have sort of permissions and agreements to read certain poems tonight, so we're going to be sticking to those, but I encourage you to buy David's work so you can encounter his other work, and we'll be putting up a link to his website later so you can discover the Mary Magdalene poem. So we'll ask this question, and this will be our final question. I want to thank everyone for your questions. And Pádraig, after David answers this, you can just jump right in with some thoughts. So the question is, if I can find it, after the experience of rejection when you submitted the Delilah poem, did you ever struggle with the role of gender and your position as a man writing about women?
Yes, I did. You're not the first person to ask me that question. I think it's a legitimate question to ask. I would say two things in response to that. First of all, I believe very strongly in the imagination. And I think that if men simply wrote about men and women simply wrote about women, the world would be a very dull place. I think that part of the whole process of being an empathetic human being is trying to put yourself in somebody else's skin and to try to see the world from their perspective. And if my collection is, my collection is an attempt to open up a dialogue between women and between the patriarchs that circumscribe their life, their lives to some extent. It is a form of speaking back. I'm a gay man, and I have frequently found myself being looked down upon by straight people. Fortunately, it hasn't happened very often, but I found myself in difficult and awkward situations of that kind. And I feel, therefore, I have some knowledge, perhaps, of what women have experienced in terms of the way that men sometimes look at them. I don't believe that either of those positions gives me full permission to speak from a woman's perspective or a woman's point of view. But I've done what I've done, and I'm prepared to be judged accordingly.
Thanks, David. Kind of building on that, I'm curious, because you do tread the line or hold the space between not being interested in causing offense, but also you're not writing poetry for the purpose of devotion or dogma, certainly, or homiletics. What for you is the discipline of looking at biblical characters in a way where you can see them in their humanity? I'm sure there's some people who are in the room or who'll be listening later on whose public work is the opening up of a text, maybe in a homily, and they might be curious about how it is they could that they could begin to see characters a little bit like how you do.
A close attention, first of all, to the actual text itself, and then maybe not necessarily to the text. As I say, quite a lot of these poems, maybe this is something that I haven't said previously, I can't honestly remember, but quite a few of these poems are ekphrases. They're based on paintings, they're based on visual art. And I have found visual art extremely helpful for thinking about these biblical figures, and then stepping away from both the visual art and the text, and simply trying to live with that particular story, with maybe the beginnings of a voice, an accent, until that voice starts to sound real, starts to sound natural. And then at that point, I go back to the biblical text or to the visual art, and to check that experience of living with that character against that source. That's the kind of process that I went through when I was writing these poems. It's a kind of to and fro between the text or the visual art and dreaming. That's what it comes down to, perhaps, at the end of the day.
I mean, you're telling us about your process, but you're also telling us about how deeply connected you are to some of the things you're highlighting in your poems. The Hebrew women are saying, we've got saucers for halos, and they're saying faith is the work that we're doing in front of us. And then also with Joseph, you're exploring the question of dreams. And so these poems are as physical in the sense of reading a book or looking at a picture, a painting, as well as about going into your own dream world. It seems so interesting that the poems are a reflection back of you too, as well as of the characters you're exploring.
I hope so, Pádraig. That sounds like a good description to me. I'm happy to settle for it. I don't think there's much more that I can add to that, to be honest.
In a while, I'm going to just hand back to Ben in a sec, but I would be curious to hear a little bit more about your interest in masculinities, and particularly exploring that through Joseph. We'll be finishing off at the end with another poem from the Joseph sequence. We won't be commenting on it, or you won't be, but I'm curious, what else in the Joseph sequence was curious to you in the question of your own masculinities, the societal masculinities in Scotland or elsewhere, as well as the idea of Joseph as man?
To be honest with you, I didn't really think about this particular sequence, the Joseph sequence, in relation to masculinity in the first place. I mean, I can see that is an issue, obviously. It was much more the whole business of fatherhood, the relationship between a father and a son, a father and an absent son to some extent, or a son who's physically present but spiritually elsewhere, and in that sense kind of disconnected from Joseph. And as I said before, that's a position that I found very moving and that I wanted to explore. But masculinity, yes, in the sense that Joseph is emasculated to some extent. I think that is something that he experiences and tries to cope with. But he's somebody who, or at least to me, he comes across as somebody who is very clear about himself. You know, his dreams, it's almost like looking through the wrong end of a telescope. It's as if he's watching his life. It's very small, it's in the distant, but it's all terribly, terribly clear. And his dreams give him a kind of perspective on himself, on his weakness, but also on his determination as well, his determination to go on. So I think there's a great sense of acceptance as well that comes through in Joseph's character.
Thanks very much, David. We'll be hearing a final poem from the Joseph sequence from you in a while, but for now I want to hand back from Ben. He's got a few announcements.
Thank you so much, David and Pádraig. We're so grateful for the conversation. And as you can see, there's plenty of comments coming in where people are expressing their gratitude for our time together. As Pádraig said, we are going to close with a poem from David, so don't sign up quite yet. We just have a couple final announcements to send you on your way. The first one being on behalf of the On Being Project and the Washington National Cathedral. We give you a heartfelt thanks to all of you for attending, for your presence, for your questions, and even the questions that maybe you couldn't quite articulate yet or we didn't get to. Thank you for all of that. Lily will be adding a short survey to the chat for you to let us know what you thought of this gathering. And this is a way to let our social healing team know who you are and how we might serve you in this moment. So we really encourage you to fill that out. And, that's a great chance to connect with us. Keep an eye out on YouTube for a recording of this conversation that you can share with your friends. You can find it both on the On Being Project's YouTube channel as well as the Washington National Cathedral's. And this is some really exciting news you want to make sure to be aware of, that just over 2 weeks from now, on April 26th, season 3 of Poetry Unbound, the podcast, will be coming out and featuring 8 weeks of new poems that Pádraig will be discussing and interacting with, much like the kind of conversation that we've had here. And our next Poetry Unbound Plus is on Sunday, May 2, with poet Lorna Goodison. And you can find registration info through On Being and the Washington National Cathedral. And just like these events, it will be available on YouTube after the live conversations. So again, thank you for being here. And with that, I'm going to hand it back to Pádraig.
Thanks very much, Ben. And David, I'd love it if you'd close off by reading another dream from the Joseph's dream sequence.
Sure. Another dream. Sometimes I dream my dreams are simple palimpsests of sun through cloud. But in my dream, I may not dream of dreams, and the sun is a perpetual light switched on so I can act in this strange gilded world. where rulers work as terrorists and hunt my perfect son. Flee into Egypt, voices say, or rest here, dream here, where the water is pellucid as the voice that speaks my dream. I wake, but the dream continues. I look into Egypt's dust and see the plain deal table in the kitchen back at home, a woman who's half familiar, and a simple boy looking up at me with adoration.
David Kinloch, many thanks for your gift and for your time and the generosity in reading these poems from this magnificent book. We're so appreciative of all that you've given to us.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me. It's been a real pleasure. And thank you all for your extremely interesting questions. It's made me think more deeply about my own poems. So thank you very much for that gift.
And thanks to the Washington National Cathedral and to all who were here. Many thanks for coming. Good night from Ireland and from Scotland and from all the places where we are. Thank you again, and we'll see you soon.
Bye.